I heard the question asked, can one person really make a difference, a positive difference on culture? And I have another question for us. Should Christians be involved in politics? You can think about those while I'm talking to you. Last week we talked about heroes, the importance of having heroes, especially for our young people. Talked about the fact that we need good heroes rather than anti-heroes. And we talked about Eric Liddell, and he certainly fit the bill for that. So today I want to talk to you all about someone. The movie Amazing Grace was made about him. Do any of y'all know who that was? Grace knows. Do you remember his name? William Wilberforce, that's right. So William was born in 1759 to a very prosperous family, and when he was 9, his father died. And so to explain a little bit to you about the culture in England at that time, it was probably years of religious wars. People were pretty much indifferent to religion, especially if you were of any social standing. You kind of looked down on people who took God too seriously. They were called, in a scornful way, enthusiast or Methodist. And if you were anybody of any social standing, it was a very superficial religion, and probably what we would call enlightenment or deism was what was commonly preached from the average pulpit. It was a very impersonal, vague God, and it was a very superficial. And as you can understand, people were kind of turned off by religion after years and years of all the bloody battles over religion. And so when William's father died, his mother and grandfather decided that it would be best for William to go live with, his mother was ill also and not expected to live, and they decided it would be best if he went and lived with a wealthy aunt and uncle in another part of England, in Wimbledon. And there they hoped that he would have the best of social upbringing. It was very important to them for him to be in an elite social circle. And so William went there, and what the mother and grandfather did not realize, however, was that the aunt and uncle were actually very serious Christians, closet Methodists, if you will. And so much so that they would give of their resources to further the cause. And oftentimes they would have what they would call parlor preachers come to their home. And William loved it. He thrived in it. He had become a Christian even at that young age. And one particular preacher that would come became almost like a father figure to him. And you might be surprised to know that that was none other than John Newton, the former slave trade captain. And so, however, these happy times were not to continue. The mother and grandfather realized what was happening, and they quickly went and got William and yanked him from that home, and he really loved his aunt and uncle. They took him back, and they tried their best to de-educate him and get him away from the religion, so much so that they wouldn't even let him go to the superficial church services in England because it might have some ill effect on him. So needless to say, by the time William entered Cambridge, he was just as skeptical and aloof about anybody that was religious as any other socially elite person in that day. And while he was at Cambridge, he and a friend had a habit of going and watching parliamentary debates in the House of Lords. And to make a long story short, William found it almost intoxicating. He loved it. He was a very intelligent, witty young man, and he decided that politics was the way he was going to go. And by the age of 20, just as young as he could be elected, 2 weeks after his 20th birthday, he was elected to the House of Parliament. And by the age of 24, in almost a miraculous turn of events, he was elected to one of the highest positions of power and prestige in the House. And his friend, at the age of 24, was the Prime Minister of England. So these two young men had just rocketed through politics and soared to the very highest, dizziest pinnacle that you could imagine of power and prestige. And with that came all the social partying. He had access to celebrities, to clubs, exclusive clubs, and drinking and gambling and anything that you could imagine. But about this time, a dramatic turn happened in William's life. His mother got ill, and so he decided to take a trip to take her to a warmer climate and to go on this long trip across Europe. And being in a coach by himself, she was going to be in another one, he wanted to find a traveling partner, one that would be great to be with. If he chose the wrong one, it could be no fun at all because it was going to be hours and hours and hours. And so he ran across Isaac Milner, an acquaintance from a school he had attended when he was younger. But at this time, Mr. Milner held the position of Lucasian professor at Cambridge. And if you don't know what that means, it's the position that Isaac Newton once held, and more recently Stephen Hawking. So Mr. Milner was a very intelligent and jolly person. And so he accepted the all expenses paid trip. And on this trip, much to Wilberforce's dismay, he found out yet again this man, robust, intelligent, vivacious man, but not outwardly religious. He had a very deep faith in God. And even though Wilberforce did not want to even imagine, as they debated, he was intellectually honest and he liked robust debate. And so by the end of that trip, he came to realize that everything he had thought was false was actually true. He realized that the God of the Bible existed, that Jesus existed in history and was the promised Messiah, and that the scriptures were not just silly old myths, but were actually truth. So now he has a great dilemma on his hands. How could someone in his political, social standing admit that he had had a conversion experience and believed in God? He knew he'd be a laughingstock. He immediately gave up his partying lifestyle and kind of went into a little period of self-imposed seclusion while he was thinking this all through. And he really felt like he was going to have to give up politics as well because he just couldn't reconcile the two. So he went back, hoping no one would see. He went and found his old friend, John Newton. And John Newton encouraged the young Wilberforce not to give up politics at all. He said, "Who knows but that you were created for such a time as this? Who knows but what God might mightily use you in politics?" And so less than 2 years later, Wilberforce wrote in his diary, "God Almighty has set before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners." And by reformation of manners, he meant reformation of morality or culture. And to further explain that, the slave trade wasn't the only evil thing in England at that time. The culture did not hold a biblical worldview at all, did not put any respect on human life. Child labor was really egregious. 5- and 6-year-olds were made to work 12-hour days in really dangerous conditions. Alcoholism was at an all-time high. It was said, he said, that even legislators were drunk a lot of times in the legislative sessions. Sexual trafficking of women was really bad. 25% of all single women at that time in England were prostitutes. And so he knew something had to be done. And those were the two things he felt like God had put on his heart, was to try to end the slave trade and to work on the other issues. So he also realized that this was a calling from God and that he couldn't do it in his own strength, that he was simply an instrument. And so he surrounded himself with a group of Christians famously known as the Clapham Circle. And he also realized that in order to end the slave trade, that it was a cultural battle. And so he decided that he would use his position of influence, and he had a really big position of influence, to make goodness and doing good fashionable. And so when other notable leaders of that time were leading very openly immoral lives, he would spend his Sundays at home with his family, playing with his children inside the house and outside the house. And it sent a really big statement that family was important. And he also made it clear that we should help others. At that time, people thought that if you were having a bad time in life, if you were poor, that it was God's judgment on you. They didn't have any obligation to help you whatsoever. So he changed that perception by doing good and helping others. So what about the Wilberforce that was a politician and a statesman? Well, he had a personal relationship with God now, and he was motivated by love for God and love for his fellow man. He was quick to share credit for any accomplishments he made. He was able to work with people he disagreed with, people that were opponent on many other, disagreed vehemently with him on other issues. When he found a common bond, he would work with them wholeheartedly. He did not demonize his opponents, even when passionately debating against them. And he included himself as part of the problem because he realized that before his great change of heart, he was part of the problem too. So you could say that his grace and civility went a long ways in helping those that were on the fence on the issue of the abolition of slavery. He was a man that believed that obedience to God was paramount, but doing so in a gracious way and leaving the results to God was just as important as winning. So did he win? After 18 years of heartbreaking effort and many crushing defeats, in 1807, the abolition of the slave trade itself was largely done away with. So he continued to work to ensure that that promise was fulfilled. They had hoped that it would end slavery altogether, but it didn't. And so he spent the next several years trying to get rid of slavery itself and working with other world powers to do the same. And it wasn't until 3 days before his death, the last day he was conscious, that a young member of Parliament came and told him that slavery itself had been abolished in England. And so I wanted to speak to you all personally and see how wrong slavery was. I don't think there's a person in here that would think that slavery was okay, but many people of that time did not see it. They did not see that it was an important issue until the ugliness and the evilness of it was revealed to them. So today we don't have slavery, but we definitely have other issues that are just as important, like abortion, for instance. And I wonder, will one day our society look back and realize how ugly and evil it is? Will our children and grandchildren wonder how on earth we could have let that go on so long? And will God use some of you all to help eradicate abortion in our day? I say that if our world lasts long enough, we will be able to look back and point to the William Wilberforces as heroes in our cultural issues. So back to my two questions at the beginning. Is it possible for one person to make a difference? I would say it is. And is it good for Christians to be involved in politics? I think we could answer wholeheartedly that yes, it is. So I hope y'all will remember William Wilberforce's life and follow his example of being a hero.